Good morning again. Hello to those of you joining us on YouTube as well. My name is Joe, my pronouns are he and him, and on my mother's side, my family is from the Swiss Anabaptists, who are not really from Switzerland, by way of the Pennsylvania Dutch Mennonites, who are definitely not Dutch. And I have married into a family of Russian Mennonites who are not particularly Russian, and in all likelihood actually do have Dutch roots. Follow any of that? I will explain in a minute. This is the last week of our series on the basics of Anabaptism, and today we're going to wrap up with a global journey through 500 years of church history, the Trails of the Mennonites. I know, it's a gnarly old map in a foreign language. Who is excited? Way back in April, we began by talking about the origins of Anabaptism in the 1500s. The Reformation with Martin Luther, the radical Reformation of Ulrich Zwingli, George Blaurock, Conrad Grebel, and friends, the Anabaptist rebellion of Munster, and the subsequent emergence of humble and stable Anabaptism through the influence of Menno Simons. That's where we started. And then last week, Len Rempel gave us a global view of Anabaptism today, stories of his work with the Mennonite World Conference, with a majority of Anabaptists now living in Africa, India, Asia, and South America. Today the question is, how did we get from there, George Blaurock, the one first rebaptized guy, how did we get from there to here? And why do we, or at least me, why do I continue to put myself at the center of the Anabaptist story when we are very much in the minority in terms of geography and culture and theology? I mean, it is human nature, but I'm not excited to admit that every time I come across this map, I am still surprised to see that there are twice as many Anabaptists in India as in Canada. I didn't even know they liked farmer sausage and veronica in India. I'm joking, but when I think of Mennonites, I think of people like me. And that is a very limited picture, and it always has been. I mean, in what way is Menno Simons in the 1500s a person like me? Or the dairy farmer in the Vishwa Delta in the 1700s? Or the refugee family arriving in the green hell of the Paraguayan jungle in the 1920s, and so on? How are these people my people? What does it mean to be Anabaptist and Mennonite? I have very confidently given my perspective on that, but maybe my take is not as central as I tend to think it is. Anyway, the sermon today is all about context. How did we get from there to here? And then what are the gifts and baggage that these middle years have given us? Let's have some more fun with maps. The Anabaptist story typically starts here in Zurich in the 1520s. That is where the first rebaptism took place. And as Zurich was the center of trade and communications in their region, the word spread quickly. The community of young Anabaptists there sent out teachers that shared ideas across Central and Northern Europe. And by sent out, I mean they often were running away from arrest and persecution. So as they went, as people moved, they brought their ideas with them. Ideas don't follow in a neat line. And really, there were Anabaptist ideas bouncing all over the place in the 1500s. This map tries to represent that with the fuzzy borders. This is kind of where the folks followed a particular leader, or where this group of ideas kind of held sway, but really there was a lot of overlap and not a ton of organization. So where this map has four colors, it can be a bit difficult to see there, but there are four different colors representing four different branches of the Anabaptist movement, but I have learned to see it in three main groups. The purple group up here is where the Anabaptists first became known as Mennonites, in and around Holland and Friesland in northern Germany. This is where the violent revolution of Munster happened, as we talked about, and where Menno Simons subsequently became the leader of a church that was much more quiet and peaceable collection of communities rather than the violence of elsewhere. While Menno lived out his life in and around this region, mostly in hiding, in the 1500s, many of his followers chose to leave and go northwards and east to the safer region in Poland in and around Danzig. Then we have this green group, it's green on my map, that around Zurich that became known as the Swiss Brethren. Sorry, sisters, your time had not yet come. Eventually, they would move around a bit, and then they would settle kind of up here in this area around Strasbourg, in the border between France and Germany. It was kicked back and forth a number of times. So they settled into that area for around 200 years because they had a similar faith, similar values, and that identity of peace and disengagement. They shared that along with the Dutch Anabaptists. They became known as Mennonites, even though they owed no particular allegiance to Menno Simons. So Swiss Mennonites, not particularly Swiss, and not so much with the Menno bit either. Then we have the blue group here, and I combine them together with the yellow group as the South German Anabaptists that were mostly aligned around the ideas of a leader named Jacob Hutter. So they became the Hutterites, the direct ancestors of our Hutterite neighbors here on the Canadian prairies. The Hutterites were also known as the Moravian Anabaptists because in the 1530s, most of them moved from over here into Moravia. So that's the picture in the mid-1500s. You have the Dutch Mennonites in purple, starting around Holland, moving to Danzig, mostly now in Poland. You have the Swiss Mennonites in green, starting in southern Germany and Switzerland, and now mostly in the west of Germany and into France. And you have the Hutterites in blue, starting in other areas of Switzerland and southern Germany, and now mostly moving towards Moravia. A big reason why all of this is fuzzy is because in every case the Anabaptists the numbers were small. This was a small minority religion among their Catholic and Protestant neighbors. They moved around because their religion and their politics made them unwelcome with both the Catholics and the Protestants. So when those kingdoms went at each other with war, the Anabaptists were often caught in the middle. So most of the early movement was about safety and religious freedom. In Poland, in Moravia, and in the Palatinate region, between Germany and France there, they found tolerance and they found out-of-the-way spaces where they could be, where they could raise their families, live their lives. In the case of the Swiss Anabaptists, that lasted a good long time. Generally speaking, it was peaceful, and they remained there for around 200-ish years. The Hutterites in Moravia were not so fortunate. For 50 years, things went well. It was the golden years of the Hutterites, and their settlements expanded in Moravia and in the south into Hungary. They grew to around 20,000 or 30,000 people. But then war found them, several wars. And their communities were decimated. Again, they were caught in the middle. Sometimes they were just bystanders that got caught up in it. Sometimes they were forced to participate in various ways. Anyway, eventually they were decimated, and those that remained were forced to move into Hungary and then to Romania. And eventually, as you see on the map, in the 1770s, they made their way over to the Ukraine. At that point, they were a group of around just 100 people. So from hundreds to tens of thousands, and then back to just 100 over 2 centuries. In the Ukraine, they found and mixed and mingled with their spiritual cousins who had also just arrived, the purple people, the Dutch Mennonites from Poland. While the Hutterites were struggling for survival in the southeast, the Dutch Anabaptists were making their way in the northeast. In Danzig, the Mennonite refugees were tolerated, but they were not recognized as citizens, so making a living in the city itself was difficult. The Danzig officials saw this. They didn't want to make them citizens, but they offered them a solution. You're from Holland, you're good with wetlands, how about we give you a swamp and you can go live there? So that was their best option at the time. They were mostly city folk there, the Dutch Mennonites, and they didn't know much about agriculture, but that was their best prospect. And so they drained the swamp, and soon they made the Wisła Delta a thriving region of prosperous dairy farms. It was in Poland that the Dutch Mennonites truly solidified a separate culture. They ran their own schools, they developed their own language, Plautisch, and some of you speak it well enough to know that I'm not saying it correctly. They did not pay taxes, they refused military service, but because they worked hard and because they brought economic and trade advantages there, the local governments mostly left them to do their thing. And there they grew to a community of about 10,000 people. And here that peace lasted for a long time, a century and a half. In the late 1700s, the region then became part of the Kingdom of Prussia. The new government tolerated the Mennonites, but upped the ante on them, raised the price, extra taxes. And then it was announced that, well, only men who had served in the military were allowed to own land. leaving few economic prospects for young Mennonites. So when Catherine the Great, Queen of Russia, announced that she was looking for Europeans to settle unoccupied farmland in what we know as Ukraine, hundreds of Mennonite families jumped at the chance. So this wave of migration went from roughly 1800 to 1830, and a few thousand immigrants settled and then thrived in the Ukraine, and eventually they grew to around 45,000 people across several Mennonite colonies and many towns within those colonies. Again, they were separate from their neighbors in many ways. They had their own Low German language and schools and farms and trade. Many of them became quite wealthy and controlled great amounts of land. It's not unlike how we see our Hutterite neighbors in Saskatchewan. At least that's the picture that I have in my head. Separate, peaceful, generally good neighbors, but quite powerful in their own ways. So these Dutch Mennonites were now thoroughly Russian Mennonites. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, the Swiss Mennonites in the Palatinate were roughly settled, were there for around 2 centuries, and they grew to a significant population. But then a couple of things brought major changes. For one, there was a significant church split in the late 1600s. The reasons for a church split are always complicated, but as you might guess, the core was about, well, who's in and who's out, and how do we, who see ourselves as in, how do we treat those who are the outsiders? One of the leaders of the more exclusive group was a man named Jacob Amen, and when his group decided to separate, they became known as the Amish. So we have more cousins in cape dresses. Around the same time, the late 1600s, European expansion into North America was picking up steam. So much is going on in the wider world while the Mennonites are just doing their thing. A wealthy merchant named William Penn gained control of a large swath of land in the British colonies with a vision for political utopia in rights and freedoms, especially religious freedom. William Penn was an English Quaker. Quakers are a whole other story. They have similar religious ideas to the European Anabaptists, but they got there by a very different path. So they are cousins by ideas, but not by ethnicity. Anyway, William Penn founded the land of Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, and invited religious groups that were persecuted and marginalized in Europe to come and settle the land in exchange for religious freedom. Swiss Mennonites were tired of getting caught between France and Germany, and many of them took the offer. Around 100,000 Mennonites, Quakers, and Amish left Europe to begin life in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. The Pennsylvania Dutch, they were called, presumably because they spoke Deutsch, and the non-German Pennsylvanians weren't smart enough to understand that that was German and not actually Dutch, so Pennsylvania Dutch. Great quilts, great sausage. Anyway, I lived close to them for a long time. In the New World, many Anabaptists remain separate in farming colonies, and you will still find plenty of stereotypical Amish and Old Order Mennonites and Church of the Brethren with varying degrees of commitment to horse and buggies and bonnets and suspenders in their culture. Many Anabaptists have remained that way in the time since, and many have left the farm and took different paths. Did you know that the Hershey chocolate factory, the famous Hershey chocolate bars, was started by a Mennonite? At least he had a Mennonite parents. Milton Hershey, the classic American dream entrepreneur, rags to riches story, began life as a Mennonite in the 1800s. As the colonies in North America grew, the Mennonites went with them to Virginia, to Ohio, to Indiana, and then in the early 1800s, 2,000 Swiss Mennonites moved to Ontario, Canada. Happy Canada Day. These days, the ethnic group of Swiss Mennonites are mostly in the east and in the Midwest of the US and Canada. So that's a big part of the story there. The Russian Mennonites took a different route to North America. Back in the Ukraine, things were mostly going well from a population and economic standpoints on their separate colony. They're very separated, isolated from larger culture in their colonies. But in the late 1800s, the world got close, it closed in. There was nationalism happening in Europe, lots of growing armies and empire building. This is all leading up to the world wars, and Russia was a part of that. The Mennonites' special status as non-participants in the military was called into question, as were their German language schools. Not a great time to be speaking the language of people opposed to Russia. As a result, about half of the 40,000 Mennonites decided to move to the US and to Canada, so 20,000 folks moving. Many settled in Kansas, and many settled in friendly Manitoba. Around 1895, several thousand of those moved on to Saskatchewan, with one group settling in Swift Current, some of you have roots there, and another in the lovely valley around Hague and Osler. Very close to home now. The Hutterites also took advantage of those opportunities, moving from the Ukraine to the prairies around the same time. Here again, life in the New World offered this promise of religious freedom, educational autonomy, guaranteed exemption from military service, and this large expanse of unoccupied farmland to own and to live on. Too good to be true. Back in the Ukraine, the combo of World War I and then the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 1900s brought disorder, economic failure, and famine to the Mennonite colonies there. In the 1920s, another 20,000 refugees left the Ukraine, mostly to join their Mennonite relatives in Canada. Then finally, during and after World War II, a third wave of Russian Mennonite refugees were settled lots of places, but mostly in Paraguay, in colonies there. And some of those eventually, this map doesn't have a good arrow, but some of them went from Paraguay up to Vancouver, which is where I met a number of those. Many of our friends in Mennonite Church BC came out of that group, which is why part of the reason why the church that I was pastor at in Vancouver had services in German and English and Spanish. Lots of cultures mixing together in this journey. So that is how I got here, from a Swiss-German Mennonite family in Pennsylvania to a Russian Mennonite via Paraguay church in Vancouver to a marriage into a first-wave Russian Mennonite family in Saskatoon. I hope that all makes sense to you now. You'll have to go back and listen to the tape. Long story short, this is where I belong. And I know that some of you know these stories better than I do. I hope that some of you have been able to place your own families into these journeys as well. But wait, this is not the full story. What about all of these Anabaptists in the rest of the world? How did we come to have over 800,000 Anabaptists in Africa and 400,000 in Asia, which is, again, by far the majority of Anabaptists in the world? Part of the answer is what you would probably guess: missionaries. As European explorers and colonizers moved across sub-Saharan Africa in the 1860s and 70s, Christian missionaries of all stripes soon followed. Mennonite and Brethren churches were part of that mission as well, beginning in 1890, sending a handful of missionaries to Liberia, Sudan, and the Congo. Over the next 30 years, Anabaptists joined in missionary work in most other African countries as well. It's hard to see on the map, but the largest Anabaptist populations are in Ethiopia and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which are not easy places to be a pacifist Christian. How did that happen? I mean, we sent the missionaries, we've heard that part, but how did they grow from a handful of folks to these congregations, these places that have 200,000 people, and then total of 800,000 in Africa? The honest answer is, I don't know. I would like to find out. I did have the chance last year to meet some people from the Edmonton South Sudanese Mennonite Church, which reinforced how much of their story I just don't know at all. Anabaptism in India has much the same origin, although the missionaries that first went there came from the Mennonite colonies in Ukraine. I understand that the bulk of the Anabaptists there currently have come from the lower castes. Again, I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know how that came to be, and that would be worth knowing. The other main area of Anabaptist in Asia is Indonesia, which actually had the first Mennonite missionaries come in 1847 from the Netherlands. The Dutch were the main colonizers of Indonesia, and Dutch Anabaptist missionaries followed, mainly starting churches on the island of Java, which is where the Mennonite World Conference Global Assembly happened in 2022. The next global gathering is in Ethiopia in 2028. If you want to go, you can start saving your pennies. Again, I don't know much of anything about Anabaptism in that part of the world, but I am curious. These histories of world missions are complicated. On the one hand, it's hard to find fault with individuals and organizations that brought humanitarian aid, that started schools and hospitals and orphanages, took care of people. And on the other hand, it's no accident that Western mission projects followed in the footsteps of colonial governments that extracted many resources and exploited local workers. And of course, that's not only in the past, and the complicity of the Christian church in that is ongoing. We are part of that colonial story. For today, I'll just say that there's a whole lot more to these stories than the foreign missionaries. In the story of European Anabaptism, it's much too simplistic to say, well, this is all about Menno Simons and George Blaurock and Jacob Hutter. The leaders were important, but Anabaptism was about the ideas. It was about the people who chose them. It was about the church members who committed to living nonviolently, the families who chose to take the plunge into the unknown of a new colony in the name of religious freedoms, the young men and women who saw life outside the church and said, no, I will choose to build my life within this community instead. Likewise, in Africa, in Indonesia, in Brazil, I imagine with the 8 Anabaptists on the island of Grenada, this isn't the story of European missionaries bringing the gospel and convincing the locals to join the Mennonite church. That's boring stuff. It's about the people in these places who caught the vision, who resonated with these Anabaptist values, who are continuing to adapt their faith into their local context in ways that grow and strengthen their people. So we are part of this story, but it is so much bigger than us. And I wonder how much we could learn and grow if we approach this wider Anabaptist story with curiosity and with humility. I've got to catch my breath, maybe you do too. We went across 5 centuries and all the way around the world in under 20 minutes. Not bad. I had planned to do this sermon in 2 halves, one half being the history part and then one half being talking about the lessons of the journey, the things that we can learn from where our Anabaptist roots have gone. Turns out there's not a whole lot of time left for that today. So here are some things that I've thought about while I was doing this research, and I will present these lightning round style, and if you care to unpack them later, that would be fantastic. Whether you're part of this whole ethnic journey or a relative newcomer, as a community, we have inherited some pretty amazing gifts from our ancestors. A strong work ethic and a whole pile of resilience. When trouble finds us, we dig in, often literally. We rebuild, we create, we grow. As individuals, but especially as a community, we strive to be reliable and self-sufficient. And we learned that from the people who lived that out before us. Also, with so many refugee stories in our past, we've learned to live with a more with less lifestyle. Do the best you can with what you have. Stretch the dollars or whatever currency. Make the food and the supplies last. Don't waste anything. We have been reducing and reusing and recycling long before it was cool. Another gift is that we are connected to the earth and its seasons. So many of the pictures of Mennonite history are of people standing in front of buildings, but really we are people of the land. The story isn't the buildings, the story is the farming and the gardening and the cooking and the crafting. Not that all of us are anti-technology, but we have this relationship, this codependence with the land and with the natural world. All of that is central to who we are. And of course, there is family and community throughout these stories. These people survived because they stayed together, because they worked together, because they served each other and trusted each other. Not everyone has that. Not every story has that. Sometimes we take it for granted, those of us who play the Mennonite game and have all these connections and the shared family trees and all of that. Not everybody has those connections. Most of our faith communities today look very little like the colonies in Europe, but that sense of service to each other, deep belonging, that sense of being a good neighbor, sharing the work, all of that runs deep. Of course, these gifts have negative aspects as well. We've been handed gifts, and we've also been handed some pretty difficult burdens alongside the blessings. That close community, the colony history, has also made us quite insular. It can be very hard to become fully a part of a Mennonite church. In Vancouver, Carrie and I were very connected. We were part of this church for 8 years. I mean, I was on staff. And there was always this sense of, well, we like you, but you don't get us. You're not from here, and you're probably just going to move away anyway. Well, after 8 years, we did. So they weren't wrong, but maybe that sense of not fully belonging had something to do with that. That's a pretty common story, even at a place as welcoming and inclusive as Wildwood. Something to keep in mind. On the other hand, in these stories, we have not only been insular, but also pretty divisive. So many splits and rifts. I mean, we could have had a whole story of just, this is where this group disagreed with that one and left behind, and how we divided all the way through. Sometimes that was external pressures. Most often, we just couldn't find ways to deal with differences, and so we divided. That is part of our radical Reformation heritage, I suppose. We are used to defining ourselves against. We are not Catholic, we are not Protestant, we're not Lutheran. So who are we then? Well, we're not them. And there is something to this kind of immigrant story that says that, well, when we can't disagree well, maybe we should just go somewhere else. That instinct is present, and that's a hard instinct to overcome. Speaking of this immigrant story, I don't know a ton about what psychologists call generational trauma, but this map sure looks like a recipe for that. Our people have literally been hunted and tortured, forced to move, taken advantage of, starved, and ostracized. Some of that is ancient history, much of it isn't. In this room, we have grandparents and parents, and some of us have personal history with these kinds of abuses. That stuff has impact. It gets passed on. It affects us in how we parent, in how we handle money and possessions, how we relate to governments and the secular world, how we deal with conflict, all of that stuff. This story is part of us, and part of that is resilience, and part of it is tragedy. Both of those leave their marks for generations. Part of that, too, is the very real withdrawal and mistrust of the world. We've lived in isolation, in colonies. We've long thought of ourselves as other. Most of us still do. That can be a gift at times. Mennonites do a ton of relief work and refugee settlement because our people have been there. We know what it is to leave everything behind. Not me personally, but collectively. And so we feel this urge to help and serve, as we should. At the same time, this otherness, this intentional separation, makes us deeply distrustful of governments and business and culture, anything perceived to be secular. There's pros and cons to that for sure, but as a whole, we Mennonites skew toward the conservative side of politics and social norms because of this history, more than because of our faith and our values. There's my unsolicited, politically biased social commentary of the day. You are welcome. And finally, there's a whole lot of patriarchy and colonialism in this story. Sometimes with the best of intentions, perhaps. Strongly defined family roles, division of labor can be essential for the efficiency and productivity that you need when you're preparing a brand new colony for winter on the prairies. When you're homeless and some government offers you a decent patch of farmland, well, it's understandable that you don't ask questions about what happened to the previous inhabitants. And yet, we have been complicit, and we continue to profit from the empire building of governments and wars that we used to oppose. Also, we continue to treat people differently based on assumptions about gender and sexuality and disability. That history is why we need to make explicit statements about words of inclusion, like in our bulletin. That's why we talk about gender and sexuality so much in our church. We have a lot of unlearning to do, all of us. And in my opinion, we don't actually talk about those things as much as it feels like. It's just that we didn't used to talk about them at all, and so now it feels like a lot. I already used my unsolicited social commentary for the day, so I will stop now. Anyway, I know that's a lot. That is how we got here. That is one pastor's thoughts on how the journey behind has set us up for the journey ahead. I hope that you've found a place in this story. And I hope that you've seen that at every step, God has been faithful. We have had what we needed all the way. And so we move forward in gratitude, in trust, in the spirit of following wherever God may lead us next. Amen.